For more than a century, America built its economic power around a handful of cities. Chicago moved the nation's freight, New York controlled the money, San Francisco shaped the future of technology. These cities became the command centers of the American economy, and the companies inside them became national icons. Few were more recognizable than Morton Salt. For 176 years, the little girl with the umbrella sat quietly in American kitchens, on grocery shelves, and inside garages across the country. Generations grew up seeing that brand, without ever questioning where it came from. Chicago was simply part of its identity. But then something changed. In 2024, Morton Salt packed up and moved to Kansas. Not a small branch office, not a temporary expansion, not a symbolic investment, a full relocation. One of America's oldest consumer brands decided the state that built it no longer made financial sense, and that is the part that should make every American pay attention. Because when even legacy companies with deep roots start walking away, this stops being a political debate. This becomes a story about economics, survival, and a system where the numbers no longer work the way they used to. So what changed inside America's economy that made leaving the rational choice? For most of the 20th century, America's economic power was concentrated inside a small group of cities. Chicago controlled the railroads, the commodities markets, and the industrial supply chains that connected the country from coast to coast. New York became the financial brain of the United States, where banks, stock exchanges, and investment firms controlled the movement of global capital. California, especially Silicon Valley, turned into the center of technology, venture capital, and the digital economy. These places were not just cities, they were economic machines. Every major company wanted access to their infrastructure, their talent pools, their transportation systems, and their financial networks. That concentration created enormous advantages. If you wanted the best bankers, you went to New York. If you wanted logistics and manufacturing access, you went to Chicago. If you wanted investors and engineers, you went to California. For decades, companies accepted high taxes, expensive real estate, rising labor costs, and growing regulation because the ecosystem was simply too powerful to ignore. The opportunities outweighed the cost. Being inside those systems gave businesses access to customers, capital, suppliers, and influence that smaller states could not compete with. The old model worked because economic gravity pulled everything into a few dominant hubs. The more companies concentrated there, the more valuable those cities became. But over time, the costs kept rising, while the advantages slowly started weakening. Then after 2020, the pressure accelerated. Remote work changed office culture. Technology reduced the need for physical proximity. Companies realized they could keep the talent, keep the customers, and still leave the expensive systems behind. And once that realization spread across corporate America, the entire economic equation started to change. COVID did not create America's economic problems. It exposed weaknesses that had been building for years beneath the surface. For decades, large companies stayed inside expensive legacy cities because they believed the advantages were worth the cost. But after 2020, executives across the country started asking a different question. What exactly were they still paying for? Remote work suddenly proved that thousands of employees no longer needed to sit inside downtown skyscrapers 5 days a week. Companies were spending massive amounts of money on office space that employees barely used. At the same time, commercial real estate values started falling across major urban centers. Office towers that once symbolized power became financial liabilities almost overnight. Then came rising insurance costs, higher labor expenses, expanding regulations, and growing concerns about crime and public safety in several major cities. One cost increase alone could be manageable. But together, they started creating a completely different business environment. And while legacy states were becoming more expensive, Sunbelt states were aggressively competing for investment. Texas promoted low taxes and cheaper energy. Florida offered business-friendly policies and rapid population growth. Tennessee attracted manufacturing expansion. Kansas positioned itself as a lower-cost logistics and operations hub in the center of the country. This was not random migration. It was organized capital reallocation. Companies were quietly recalculating where they could operate most efficiently in a new economic era. The old logic of concentration was breaking down. Businesses no longer needed to stay where the system was originally built. They only needed reliable infrastructure, lower operating costs, and access to talent. And once corporate America realized that, the numbers started pointing somewhere else. So, the real question became impossible to ignore. Why keep paying legacy city costs when the advantages no longer justify the price? The companies leaving Illinois are not isolated stories. They are part of a much larger shift happening across the American economy. One by one, some of the most powerful corporations in the country have started moving away from the traditional economic centers that dominated the 20th century. Citadel, one of the largest hedge funds in the world, left Chicago for Miami. Boeing moved its headquarters from Chicago to Arlington, Virginia. Caterpillar relocated to Texas after spending nearly a century tied to Illinois. Even the New York Stock Exchange shut down its historic Chicago office and shifted operations to Dallas. These are not small businesses chasing cheap rent. These are major institutions moving capital, leadership, and long-term investment into entirely different regions of the country. At the same time, millions of Americans have been relocating toward the South and Southwest. Texas, Florida, Tennessee, Arizona, and the Carolinas have all seen explosive population growth, while several older northern states continue struggling without migration. The map of economic momentum is changing in real time. Commercial office vacancy rates remain elevated across many legacy downtown areas, while business construction surges in Sunbelt cities. Tax revenue is becoming increasingly concentrated among fewer high earners in high-cost states, creating enormous pressure on governments already dealing with pension obligations and rising public spending. And underneath all of it, the same pattern keeps appearing. Money is moving south. Talent is moving south. Corporate headquarters are moving south. This is not happening by accident. The Sunbelt is absorbing the economic gravity that once belonged almost entirely to cities like Chicago, New York, and San Francisco. And once that kind of migration reaches critical mass, an uncomfortable question begins to emerge. Can the old economic centers ever fully recover? Or are we watching the balance of American power permanently shift in a new direction? This is the part of the story where the conversation stops being political and starts becoming mathematical. Because what many blue states are facing right now is not simply a business problem, it is a tax base crisis. For decades, states like Illinois, California, and New York relied heavily on a relatively small group of high earners and large corporations to generate massive amounts of tax revenue. In many cases, a tiny percentage of taxpayers funded a huge portion of the entire state budget. That system worked as long as the wealth stayed concentrated inside those states. But once migration accelerated, the model started breaking apart. High-income workers began relocating to lower tax states. Businesses moved headquarters and investment elsewhere. Wealth started leaving faster than governments could replace it, and that created a dangerous cycle. Fewer high earners meant less tax revenue. Less revenue increased pressure on state budgets. Governments responded by discussing higher corporate taxes, wealth taxes, and even exit taxes aimed at people trying to leave. But every new tax proposal created even more incentives for businesses and wealthy residents to relocate. The cycle kept feeding itself. This is what some economists describe as a fiscal death spiral. And the deeper problem is that governments are no longer just competing against neighboring states, they are competing against mobility itself. Technology and remote work made it easier than ever for productive people to disconnect from legacy systems without losing access to income or opportunity. That changes the balance of power completely. Because the real threat is not simply that companies are leaving office towers behind. The real threat is that skilled workers, investors, entrepreneurs, and entire networks of economic productivity are slowly detaching themselves from the old geographic centers of American power. And once that process begins, the consequences spread far beyond tax revenue alone. Here is the part almost nobody talks about. This is not really a story about red states versus blue states. It is a story about geography losing its old meaning in the American economy. For most of modern history, economic power depended on physical concentration. Companies needed workers close to offices, factories near rail hubs, banks near financial districts, and supply chains connected to ports and industrial corridors. That is why cities like New York, Chicago, and San Francisco became so dominant. The entire economic system was designed around proximity. If you wanted access to opportunity, you had to move where the infrastructure already existed. But technology slowly started breaking that model apart. First came cloud computing, which reduced dependence on centralized office systems. Then remote work proved millions of employees could stay productive without sitting inside expensive downtown towers. Artificial intelligence accelerated automation across industries. Logistics networks became more distributed and data-driven. Companies realized they no longer needed to cluster everything inside a handful of legacy cities to remain competitive. Suddenly, the priorities changed. Businesses started optimizing for cheaper energy, lower taxes, available land, freight access, flexible regulations, and long-term operating efficiency. The center of gravity began moving inland toward places with lower costs and fewer structural burdens. That is why this shift is much bigger than politics. America is entering a completely new geographic era. Economic power is reorganizing itself around efficiency instead of historical prestige. The old cities did not suddenly become irrelevant because people stopped loving them. They became vulnerable because the industrial math underneath them changed. The advantages that once justified extremely high costs no longer look as permanent as they did 20 years ago. And if that is true, then a much bigger question starts to emerge. What happens to the cities, skyscrapers, transit systems, and financial structures that were built for an economic model the country may already be leaving behind? The next winners in the American economy may not be the cities with the tallest skyscrapers or the biggest financial districts. They may be the places that operate with the lowest friction and the highest efficiency. Texas is rapidly expanding its logistics and industrial infrastructure. Kansas is becoming a strategic freight and distribution corridor in the center of the country. Arizona is attracting massive semiconductor investment as the United States races to rebuild domestic chip manufacturing. Tennessee continues growing as a manufacturing and supply chain hub for major corporations. These states are positioning themselves for the next phase of American industry, while many older economic centers are struggling under the weight of debt, pension obligations, aging infrastructure, and shrinking tax bases. The balance of economic power is starting to move toward regions that can offer lower costs, faster growth, and greater operational flexibility. And that means the next American supercenters may look very different from the ones that dominated the last century. Morton Salt did not leave Chicago because it stopped caring about the city that built it. It left because the future of American business no longer depends on where the past was built. And if more companies continue reaching the same conclusion, then what we are witnessing today may become one of the largest economic realignments in modern American history.